Longevity is here to stay. There's no disputing that. Retirement, as we concocted it in the 50s, is all but dead. It's the age of the 100-year life and the 60-year career. But old patterns and old thinking die hard. My guest is a big voice in a growing global movement to blow up all that furry old thinking. Ashton Applewhite, author, activist, social pioneer, is on the line from her home in Brooklyn. Hello, Ashton.
Hello.
I'm so glad you found the time to speak with the Big Middle. Your diary is crazy. It's a whirl of keynotes and lectures and workshops all over the planet, and you also do a lot of writing.
You're very welcome. It's much easier to talk than write.
Isn't that the truth?
I'm delighted to be here.
Now, it's not often that a TED talker gets a prolonged standing ovation. I urge everyone to check out Ashton's main stage TED Talk. Your observations about ageism and your arguments against it are as entertaining as they are necessary and important. I'm going to set you a challenge to start. I'm going to quote you, back to you, a succession of your best one-liners and thinking, and your challenge is to react or explain, albeit briefly.
Okay.
First one, ageism happens between the ears.
The first step in thinking about ageism is counterintuitively not the natural one of thinking, oh, I couldn't possibly be prejudiced, but actually to look for ways in which we are prejudiced, because everyone is ageist. We've been inundated with ageist messages our whole life long. So the very first step is to look hard at your own attitudes towards your own age and aging, because only when you see how you are, in a sense, part of the problem, can you become part of the solution.
Next one, diapers, drooling, dementia.
Well, I love the alliteration as a writer, and I have to say, I in that order, I would put dementia first as my largest fear. But when I first started writing about aging, which was when I was 55, so almost 12 years ago, it was because I was so afraid of the prospect, and I really saw only those 3 Ds and sort of helplessness and sadness and loneliness. And while, all those things can be part of getting older, there's also the entire other side of the story about how aging enriches us. And so I set out to make sure that both sides of the story get told.
The longer people live, you said, the less they fear dying.
I can't emphasize how skeptical and how ignorant I was to start out with. And one of my negative presumptions was that one of the things that must obviously make everything about getting older so awful was that the specter of the Grim Reaper, I literally envisioned this shadow stretching across the sad, lonely iron bedstead, would grow, larger and more terrifying as we grow closer to death. And one of the many things I learned that took me by surprise is that the longer people live, the less they fear dying. They don't want to die, and they especially don't want to die in pain. But one of the pieces of advice they routinely deliver to younger people is, first of all, don't worry so much in general. And second of all, don't worry about dying.
I like it in your TED Talk. I think you said something like the anxiety over aging is what is at epidemic proportions.
Yeah, I mean, and Alzheimer's. Yeah, also, we're more worried about all these things happening. Our worry is disproportionate by far to the actual incidence of these problems in individual lives.
Next one, all prejudice relies on othering.
That is a staple of sociology. You can even Google othering. Prejudice relies on seeing a group of people as other than ourselves, whether it's other color, other nationality, other sports team. It can be big or large. And when we see a group of people as other than ourselves, their well-being becomes less important and less of a human right. So it's that distancing. The strange thing about ageism is that other is our own future older self.
And the sooner we clock that, the better.
Indeed.
The next phrase I want you to explain or react to is ageism feeds on denial.
When I described ageism as prejudice against our own future selves, what I mean is that so many of us spend so much time and energy growing and changing until midlife, when the cultural message becomes stop. Everything needs to stay the same. Cling to youth. Aging well, in quotes, is measured by how much you can look and act like a younger version of yourself. That is denial. It is corrosive, it's impossible, it's expensive, it sets us up to compete, it sets us up to fail, and it is in that denial of something we know is happening to us every single day, and that is a source of positive as well as negative things. It is in that denial that ageism takes root, in that distancing from our own older self and from other older people and even people our own age who might not be aging quite as well as we hope to be.
Well, it's that whole business, isn't it, of allegedly successful aging. If you look 15 years younger than your biological age, you're deemed to be successfully aging.
Well, I say if you wake up in the morning, you're aging successfully.
Absolutely. Some of the language that is used that really gets up your nose. You look good for your age.
That's the one phrase I came up with a good snappy answer for. When someone says you look good for your age, just say brightly, you look good for your age too. And let that uncomfortable silence sit there for a minute, because the person probably means it as a compliment. And when it's turned back on them, they have to think about, gee, why didn't that feel like a compliment? The reason it doesn't is that it's actually drawing attention to your age. If you were in fact young, no one would say you look good for your age. So why are you drawing attention to it? And why am I supposed to be embarrassed about it? And why should I be comparing myself to other people my age, which reinforces the idea that people my age look the same way? What other age could I possibly look besides my own, you know? And think for a minute, oh, interlocutor, about why you said that, how it makes me feel, how it makes you feel. We tend to use old and young as placeholders for good things and bad things that can occur at any point in our life cycle. People say, I don't feel old. What they really mean is, I don't feel sexless or incompetent or invisible. And as we all know, thinking back for me to my teenage years, I felt all those things much more when I was 13 and 14 than I do now at 66.
Well, old has become a synonym for washed up, bad, everything that's negative, and we've just got to stop it.
Language is a very good place to start. Just think about how literally how you use the words old and young, and think about whether you might swap them out for a specific description like active or sexy or unhappy or lonely, that describes the specific thing you're feeling and doesn't relegate it to the zone of age.
Yeah, we could just get used to, if we think someone does, in fact, look fantastic, just say, you look so well, you look so healthy, you're glowing.
You look like $1,000,000.
The other thing, the companion phrase that I know gets your goat is, I'm no young lady.
Well, I really dislike to be being called young lady, because once again, it emphasizes the fact that I'm not young. So I think an all-purpose rejoinder to an ageist comment like that, or if someone calls you dearie or sweetie, is, why would you call me that? We just met. We just met. Why are you calling me sweetie? That's a little snarky, and it can be hard to avoid that. But if you put someone on the defensive, especially if they thought they were being kind, they're just going to recoil and get angry. Whereas if you can sort of course correct in a neutral way, why would you
Yeah.
call me young lady? Then again, they have to pause and reflect about why they use the phrase and what it is about it that you might not like.
The most satisfying thing is when you meet someone, happenstance, out shopping, in a restaurant, wherever, and you just engage in chit chat, and you can course correct tactfully, but efficiently, and then you maybe can take another 5 or 10 minutes to have that chat with them and
Yeah.
open their mindset.
Keep the communication open. Absolutely. It is upsetting to realize that we have bought into cultural stereotypes. It's uncomfortable. It factors back to that first question of change happens between our ears. But the great part is, once you start to see it in yourself, then instantly you start to see it in the culture around you, in the way people talk, in advertising, in billboards, on television. And that is very liberating, because then you say, oh, this is not a personal problem or a personal failing. This is a collective political issue that requires collective solutions. And that is incredibly exciting to realize.
Absolutely. And it's that going back to the social constructs and the sociological terms. I mean, we are, as a society, we are the ones that fabricated these mindsets and this conditioning. And so it's up to us. Culture is fluid. We need to change it.
Indeed, I love pointing out that it was until so recently that we used to think of gender as really pretty much a binary, male or female. And look what incredible strides we have made globally, really, in coming to understand that gender is a spectrum. And if we can do that with gender, why on earth not with age, which is obviously inherently a spectrum? Why are we so hung up on this old young binary, all panically clinging to be on, the right side of the velvet rope? That rope does not exist. It segregates us. It fills us with needless dread, and we need to get rid of that whole idea.
You've said, which ties into what we're talking about. I mean, everything does. I don't know how long I can keep this little pop quiz going because I so want to react to everything you're saying. But there's another thing that feeds into what we were just talking about. Older people can be the most ageist of all.
Yeah, I mean, that was a hard thing to realize. You just figure, well, of course not. How could that be? Just like women can be misogynist. And if you have had a lifetime of being inundated with cultural messages that to age is to fail and to have wrinkles is to be ugly, and all this stuff that comes at us negatively, and there's also the absence of older people from you know uh, television marketing, whatever, that shows older people doing things besides going on cruises and taking pills. It's very, if you don't have an alternative narrative that's available to the public and you've never thought to question the conventional narrative, of course you're ageist because you're human.
Yeah, the older you are, the longer you've had to
Oh,
internalize these social messages.
exactly.
Attitudes towards aging affect our minds and bodies at the cellular level. Do elaborate on that one.
This is so interesting to me. Um, it forms the basis for what I think is the most compelling and politically neutral argument for an anti-ageism movement, because it's ideologically neutral, whether you love old people or hate old people, whether you want there to be more of them or less of us, is the idea of an anti-ageism campaign as a public health initiative, because there is growing amounts of data that show that people with a more positive attitude towards aging, who see it as something besides, a decline into, uselessness, walk faster, they heal quicker, they're more likely to recover completely, even from severe disability. They live longer, an average of 7.5 years longer. This is not just little. Much of the research is done by this woman named Becca Levy at Yale, and her latest study, which came out this spring, shows that people with more positive attitudes are less likely to develop dementia. And believe me, researchers do not put things this categorically unless they are damn sure of their data. Less likely to develop dementia, even if they have the gene that predisposes them to the disease. The thinking is that a positive attitude helps buffer the stress of living in an ageist world, of having to deal with negative messages about incompetence, etc. And that if you know those are not true, and you have a more healthy and accurate idea of the role you can and should play in the world, that you are more resilient, and that you are healthier physically, socially, cognitively.
And you won't get the chronic diseases that are going to pack you off and have you sidelined into some sort of a living arrangement or a hospital
You're
that you
going to
do
get
not
one
want
of
to
them.
go.
I say there's only two bad things about aging that are inevitable for everyone. People you've known all your life are going to die, and some part of your body is going to fall apart. So I don't like to be portrayed as a Pollyanna about aging, because there are real aspects of it that are difficult and challenging, whether running out of money, getting sick, ending up alone. No one escapes all of those things, and we need to address that. And keep in mind, too, the roles of socioeconomic class in addressing, it's a lot easier to age, quote unquote, successfully if you can afford leisure, if you can afford caregiving, if you can afford healthy food, and also the role of luck. No one is responsible for their luck. And if you are lucky and work hard and take care of yourself, you will age more healthily. But no one gets home free. Almost all older people are managing, the very old care conditions, but they enjoy their lives,
No,
you
and there
know?
will be deficits no matter your socioeconomic status. We
Right,
are
but people
physical beings,
continue
the
to enjoy their
physicality.
lives.
Exactly. And you just I liked again referencing your TED Talk, which was so delicious and rich in information and entertainment value. But when you were talking about both of your knees,
I said, that's an example of how we tend to blame things on age reflexively without thinking. And the line is that I stopped blaming my sore knee on being 65 when I realized that my other knee doesn't hurt and it's just as old. Even me, steeped in thinking about ageism, I find myself doing that all the time. My back will be stiff and I'll go, oh God, it's, because I'm old and I have arthritis. And then I think, well, it's probably actually because I've, carried boxes or because I was up on my feet or my younger friends doing the same thing with me that day are probably just as tired as I am.
yeah, absolutely. And you slept badly. You slept like a pretzel in a weird position, which
Right.
when you're 12 and you do it, you just think, oh man, I slept badly. And then when you're 65 or 75, you're making all of these ageist excuses.
Right. I have a much younger friend whom I quote in the book who is an athlete and he exercised and he was super stiff and he said to himself, "Oh, I'm too young to be this stiff." And then because he hears my needling voice in his ear, he said, "Wait, I hadn't stretched in a week. That's why I was sore." It had nothing to do with how young or old he happened to be.
I've got a couple more Ashton Applewhite quotes that I want to feed back to you, but this one sort of plays into what we were just talking about. It all does, really. There is no line in the sand between old and young, after which it's all downhill.
Exactly. That's why I have taken to using the term older and younger as nouns. When I was writing my book, I literally got tired of typing older people, and I realized, and I'm leery of inventing new words, but olders and youngers really works, and I like it because it emphasizes this all important point that age is a spectrum where a 3-year-old will tell you in no uncertain terms that she is a lot older than that 2-year-old in the corner, just like a 99-year-old will assure you that Mrs. McGillicuddy down the hall is way older than she is, right? And in an ageist world, no one wants to admit to being old, which I hope will change, and I hope we'll get to the point where we can claim old proudly if we choose to. But almost all of us with more road behind us than ahead will readily acknowledge that we are older. So it is a way to claim it and have that position be relative to everyone else on the planet. We're all sliding along this spectrum together.
Yeah, and there's no cliff edge to it.
There is no cliff
Yeah,
edge.
unless you have a health calamity, or unless, of course, you have a freak accident, and then we know the outcome of that is bye-bye.
And guess what? That could happen at 22 as easily as at 82.
The last question in the pop quiz portion of this, I'm going to quote this to you: the silver reservoir, not the silver tsunami.
I love that phrase. It is not my coinage. It is a colleague of mine who is a social gerontologist named Jeanette Liardi came up with it as an antidote to this noxious phrase that has become sort of shorthand for population aging, this gray tsunami, referring to the fact that there are many more, that the population of the whole world is aging, and in particular to the phenomenon of the baby boom, of which I am dead center, born in 1952, is this huge wave, poised to swamp our shores and suck all the resources of you know, coffers, empty our coffers and leave younger stranded and penniless. And of course, this is no tsunami. It is the best studied demographic phenomenon in history. And Jeanette turned it very cleverly to think, referencing the fact that we now have hundreds of millions of healthy, well educated adults more than ever before in history that are a resource, and think of that silver tsunami, in quotes, filling a silver reservoir that we can and must learn how to draw upon.
The more we raise our voices about this and the more we feed it into public discourse, the message will start to get through. But I'm living in London in the UK, but I'm keeping my eye globally. And this podcast, last look, it was in 45 countries. In the rich countries, people over 50, maybe top end 55, they start to feel as if they're about to be sidelined from the labor force.
It's a huge problem, and it's worse for women. And it's worse, of course, for people of color. And it's worse, again, if you have disabilities. All these forms of discrimination, and that's what it is, compound and reinforce each other. I'm very happy, though, about the fact that there is real progress being made more in the international phrase than on the domestic front here in the US, which I wish were shocking, but is not. I had the enormous honor of giving a speech at the United Nations October 1st, which is the International Day of Older Persons, which when I rule the world will be International Olders Day. You've got to admit it sounds better.
It
And
does. Two
I
votes for
called my
that,
talk,
me and the cat.
I said, I called my talk End Ageism or the Rest is Noise. Because that's what I believe. If, whatever, whether you're talking about the labor market or social life or, what's between our ears, we need to look at the ageist way in which we frame the issue in order to address it profoundly. 2 years later, this October, the World Health Organization is developing a global anti-ageism campaign. This wonderful organization called Age Platform Europe launched a fantastic 70-day campaign under the hashtag Aging Equal, and that's aging with an E on it, which is how Americans ought to spell it, in my opinion, that culminates in 70 days on the International Day of Human Rights.
I may as well be a sub-platform for them because I'm constantly retweeting all of their output.
It's fantastic. It's a really good campaign. And last but not least, Australia on October 10th launched a national grassroots anti-ageism campaign, which is so fantastic. So it really is percolating up all over.
It's percolating up, but I still get stuck when I think there is a lot of rhetoric, there's a lot of noise, but structurally, we still have a big lag in terms of government institutions reacting to this, in terms of employers of all stripes. It still is marginalizing and silencing people once they get old, just on the basis, again, of their biological age.
Let's not forget that this change is new. Right? This is really only in the last 50 years, this massive permanent demographic change. So it's not all ageism. You use the term lag, sociologists call it structural lag. It takes time for roles and institutions to catch up. So I think rather than being dismayed by the slow pace of change, it's slow. But again, look how far we got on gender equality and how fast. So culture does change. We now have this unparalleled window of opportunity to craft a response to population aging, to shape the institutions. We have to make new roles for older people. We are making this up, and my generation is at the forefront of this change. And I hope it'll be carried along, of course, by the generations that follow me to figure out new ways for people to contribute all along the lifespan, take longer to develop our careers, perhaps peak in our careers later on so that we have more time with children when they're young, perhaps, and more time to figure out what we're going to do without feeling we also need to be at peak career. And then, of course, longer to transition out of it. And that's just one example of how it would work in one arena of our lives.
One of my previous guests is the economist, Professor Andrew Scott from the London Business School, and he co-wrote the book, a very successful book called The 100-Year Life. And he was saying, he just said, look, we're making it up. We don't know. That is why we need some sort of multi-tiered symmetry to be going on a global level where everybody can grab the nettle and start to formulate some policy around this burning issue.
But I would wave my ageism flag again and say, are we looking at the way, at the role, the effect of ageism in crafting our aspirations and our anxieties, and address that explicitly, name it, make it a priority. I'd like to see ageism on every website that's all about, aging successfully, aging healthfully. Those are all great initiatives, but none of them, they're all going to be band-aids unless we address the fundamental issue with the culture and how we ourselves think about our own impending oldness and how we do it collectively. Think of it as analogous to the women's movement. Where would the role of women in the world be without the women's movement? And can you imagine talking about changing and improving the lives of women without foregrounding structural discrimination, aka sexism?
Well, one of the stickiest notions around aging is that it's still, and for the foreseeable future, because unless we can flip the script immediately, it still enhances men and double whammy for women. Women are devalued.
Well, that was Susan Sontag's phrase, the double standard of aging. It is, we already mentioned the fact that, different forms of discrimination compound and reinforce each other. This is how, the circle of sexism intersects with a circle of ageism. We see it in the workforce very clearly. Managers stop promoting younger women to managerial positions in their 30s because they might be thinking about maybe someday reproducing. And we all know your ovaries can't work at the same time that your brain is working. I mean, it's not as though we don't have, buckets of evidence on every front. Another, punishing arena is, of course, love, romance, sexuality. If you think how crazy, if you think about sexual prime, for men, it's in their 20s. For women, it's in their 40s and 50s. So if we were, and I love saying, how much sex is actually for making babies, right? I mean, I know fertility times out, but that's not why most of us jump into bed most of the time. So yeah, I
And yet
think
the
it's,
very thought of older people, anyone, I mean, parents having sex and then grandparents having sex, it's a ridiculous culturally conditioned response
I
where we
agree.
shudder and just don't believe that they're getting any enjoyment at all out of it.
And for many women, in particular, older sex at later life is more fulfilling, and it of course can be for men as well and women if we embrace a broader notion of the forms that sex can take. If you want any part of your life to stay exactly the way it was when you were 20, then you're going to be disappointed. But most of us enjoy lots of things a lot more than we did when we were 20. I mean, that's why, I know that's true. That's why no one actually wants to be any younger, no matter how scared they are of getting older. If you think about it, it's just nutty that we embrace, the important process of adapting and changing and growing over a lifespan. And then suddenly, consumerism and capitalism and sexism and ageism impose this narrative that, whoa, you should spend a lot of money trying to, stop changing. That's crazy. That's not how we find meaning. It's certainly not how we find happiness.
I don't know where I found it, but you talked about the cruel paradox of aging. We aspire to being older. We put so much time and attention and money, let's face it,
Yeah.
into staving off ill health. And a paradox indeed, and forever cruel.
Yeah, we aspire to grow old. No one wants to die young, and yet we dread the prospect. And just that, that is a stomach churning, dread inducing prospect right there. And it's how most of us face it until we're sort of old enough that we're like, oh darn, I guess the worst is behind me now. Uh, it's why I came up with a construct. I borrowed the phrase from a geriatrician named Joanne Lynn early on, before I had any idea how important the phrase would become to me. She called herself an old person in training. And I thought, well, that's what I've become. When you become an old person in training, you get out of that idea of othering, right? You form an imaginative connection to your older self. You slip the noose of the denial trap. That older person can be as far off on the horizon as you need her to be. It is really hard to imagine being old, especially when we're young. That's not ageism. That's just human. But if you can acknowledge that someday you will get old, you don't get caught in this trap, you form an empathic connection to your future older self. And therefore, if you can see yourself as old, you start looking at the older people around you as exemplars of what you might want to be doing or looking like or saying when you are older, and maybe some stuff you also don't want to do. So that's a really important way to think about getting older. It's a little
Absolutely.
trick. It's a tool.
Now, is there anything else aside from empathic connections to your inner being and visually projecting and cultivating friendships across the generations? Is
Making
there
friends of
anything
all
else?
ages is critical. I mean, also, there's strategic aspects of it. We need to longer lives require working longer, saving more, planning better, making friends of all ages, looking after our health. There's a jazz pianist named Eubie Blake who famously said, "If I'd known I was going to live this long, I'd have taken better care of myself." Uh, so looking ahead to the future, and as humans, we're not good at that. Evolutionarily, we are crappy at planning, we have this sort of vague, fuzzy picture of the future. It's why people are bad at saving and bad at thinking about what kind of deaths they might want to plan. Really good idea to think about what kind of care you might want, what kind of place you might want to live in before the proverbial something happens and no one's thinking straight and you have to make decisions in a hurry.
I mean, we can think too much. We can analysis paralysis and be so caught up in ourselves and reflecting. And, what about living in the moment and enjoying the pleasures of every day?
Well, it's funny you mentioned living in the moment because one of the many things that startled me when I was first looking into this, and as skeptical as you could imagine, was learning about this U curve of happiness, that people are happiest at the beginnings and the ends of their lives in every culture, in every income bracket. And I was astonished when I found this out, and I sort of didn't really believe it until I came to understand the neuroscience behind it and the psychology behind it, really, which is that the awareness that time is short does not fill people with dread. They are not worried about that specter of the Grim Reaper. The awareness that time is short helps people spend their time more wisely and be more choosy about who they spend the time with and be aware of the present moment. And living in the moment is what makes kids happy because they don't know how to do anything else. And it is what is behind the upswing in late life. We
And
get better at it as we get older.
And the joy of hanging out with young people is just a continuous reminder, isn't it? When you're with young kids, you forget about all your worries.
Yep. Yep.
When did you decide age discrimination was a target worthy of your full attention?
Well, it started as a project about older people who work, catalyzed by a comment of my in-laws who were in their 80s at the time. And they said, people ask us all the time, so when are you going to retire? Why don't you write about that? So that's what I did. And it was wonderful because I got to interview a whole bunch of people in their 80s and 90s who were working and learning about longevity. And it was in 30 seconds that I learned all these way more positive and nuanced things. Still, the facts that I still start that TED Talk out with a decade later. What also happened, I mean, I always had this queasy feeling that I was sort of, eating the icing and not looking at the whole cake. Talking about older people who work was a way to sort of elide or not to pretend, if you will, that you can go on living and being in the world in your 80s and 90s as you always have, and that is not the case for anyone. And it's certainly it's only a very lucky few that manage some version of it. And I don't even think it's the thing we should aspire to. We should aspire to changing and growing and accepting change lifelong. But it got my feet wet. And then I learned all these obvious things about getting older that were more positive and nuanced than I had ever imagined. And that's what put the bee in my bonnet was, why don't we know these things? Why the discrepancy between what we think aging is like and the evidence all around us that it is much more varied, much more different, and a lot better. And the reason really is because of ageism, capitalism, patriarchy. If aging is framed as a problem, then we can be persuaded to buy things to cure it or to stop it. And if it's framed as a disease, which it is not, aging is just the natural, powerful process that every human being is embarked on. We can be told that, things like hormonal changes or balding or, just the natural physical changes that come with aging are pathologies that we should stop or treat or have operated on or cure. Wrinkles, is the obvious example. Who says wrinkles are ugly? We think cracks on an old piece of furniture are beautiful. We think that, the way a tulip looks as it explodes and the petals dry, it's spectacular.
Yeah, we just have to reframe our ideas about where we find
change those
beauty, how we
ideas.
define it.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Is there a worst example of ageism that you could point to that you've encountered when you're out and about in your daily life? Have you ever just been, jaw on the floor? Did someone really say that to me?
To me, probably not so much. I'm sort of cloddish and thick-skinned. Um, Someone just sent me, I have a blog called Yo, Is This Ageist, which is a question
Love
and answer
it.
blog. And someone did just send me a picture of a wine from a catalog, a picture of a wine glass that says, "I'm sorry you're old." And it comes from a catalog that goes out to public television subscribers. So lest we have any snobbery about, which social class or whatever might be so ill-informed, sorry, there's no reprieve for anyone at any place on the social or economic spectrum. These ideas are everywhere and they are horrible. I mean, I'm sorry you're old. I'm sorry, but the only answer I can think of is go F yourself, which I shouldn't say on the air. So there you go.
Well, I did listen to many interviews that you've done, and and you told a tale of being in a nightclub, dancing
Yeah.
away with some contemporaries, and
I,
that was clocked in a negative way by some of the other patrons of the club.
there was a more recent one, I guess Halloween last year, where a friend of mine overheard some younger people saying, "Oh, what's with all the old people here?" Which, if I hadn't been having a good time and had heard the person myself, I would have thought, perhaps I should go, look at him and say, what is having us next to you? What does that really mean to you? Why the negative reaction? Why do you not want to be near us? What's up with that?
You're going to get old age cooties. What's the deal here?
What old age cooties? And but honestly, those are people who are afraid. Most people on the dance floor either don't even notice us, the vast majority, which is absolutely fantastic. And we, often get like high fives and big smiles from people thinking, running the obvious calculus. Oh, gee, this is a ton of fun. And maybe when I'm my parents' or grandparents' age, I won't have to stop just because I got older. I mean, the idea is not to go out and look young, quote unquote, but not to stop doing the things you really love just because your age might make you conspicuous, because we change the world by what we say and also by how we act, by age integrating the world around us.
We have to ditch these social scripts. We're back to the cultural conditioning about what is age appropriate.
There's no such thing, except there is, of course, for children. But once you are at the age of consent, there is no such thing as age appropriate.
Time to get personal, Ashton. Before we go, I want you to finish these sentences. When I need to let loose, I ...
Go dig something up in my garden. Just get dirty with what my mother used to call good clean dirt, or go jump around at a dance club. I find dancing. I'm a terrible dancer, but I just find that you can't be unhappy. And you can't be anything but in the moment when you're dancing. And so that's sort of my religion.
Yeah, music and endorphins. It's the perfect combo, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really fun.
Another phrase. When I'm 84, I want to be ...
I want to be in the world. It's funny. That's a hard question because I want to be in the world in interesting ways. But I don't know what forms they're going to have. I don't know how healthy I'll be. I don't know how mobile I will be. I'm super healthy, but I do have arthritis and all the osteo, hyphenated things. And so I don't want that to summon up in your listeners the idea that I will be in the world in the way I am now. It's going to change, but I surely hope I'm a very thinky person. So I surely hope I am engaged in the world of ideas as actively as I am now. And I certainly hope that I will continue to have friends of all ages, and why wouldn't I, frankly, who continue to hang out with me, stimulate me, and as well as I sure hope a lot of my friends my age and older are still around.
Yes, I guess engagement. We can never forecast anything, but staying engaged with ideas and to stay sharp is a marvelous thing.
But it's luck. It's a lot of luck. It does help if you use your brain. I mean, the very best things you can do are learning an instrument and learning a language. I hate to say it because of the rote memorization, which is no fun. I caught myself in an ageist thought recently, though. I was thinking, well, I'm never going to learn to play an instrument. I'll be, by the time I stop doing this stuff or have the time, I'll be too old. And then I thought, no one's saying you have to perform on Carnegie Hall. If you buy a saxophone and make nasty bleeding noises in your living room when no one else is around, who's to say you'll be too old for that?
Absolutely. And technologically, you can just, plug in and put the headphones on and away you go.
Right.
The last one. Finish this sentence. People have no idea that I ...
I might put this on my tombstone, but I'm probably not going to have a tombstone, that I was a clue on Jeopardy. the famous American game show. I didn't have a TV at the time. I was in my 20s living in New York, and my phone rang. That was back when we had landlines. And it was my parents who didn't watch Jeopardy, but a lot of their friends did. And they said Ashton was a clue on Jeopardy. It's a bit of a bait and switch because the clue, it was pseudonymous. I must tell the truth. I had written a series of joke books that was the best-selling book of 1982 or 3, and it went on to be this huge phenomenon. And the clue was, who is the author of Truly Tasteless Jokes? And the answer was my nom de plume, Blanche Not.
Well, I, of course, knew this because I posed the question hoping you'd give that answer. I didn't know how many secrets you had in the cupboard.
Not very many.
But that is really wonderful. And getting back to your book, I'm curious about the title. I mean, did you have 3 different titles, or did you just know you wanted to call it This Chair Rocks?
Oh, God, no. It was a hideous, painful process. I mean, I didn't even want to write another book. Writing a book is the worst, but then people told me I must, so I did. The first name of the project was So When Are You Going to Retire? Back when it was a project about older people. Then for a while, it was Staying Vertical, because that was my exhortation to myself when a late night excursion was involved. But I realized that that was ageist and stupid because you don't have to be vertical to age well. You don't even have to be mobile to age
And
well.
mountain climbers might think it's all about them.
Right. And then I just came up with This Chair Rocks because I liked rocks and I like to play on rocking chair. Although it's sort of a terrible title because it doesn't mean anything in itself. So I like to emphasize to my publisher, I was just connecting. I have a British publisher. The book's going to be brought out by Melville House in the UK next spring as well, which is exciting. I self-published it, and then I sold the rights a year ago to a new division of Macmillan here called Celadon. And saying yes, This Chair Rocks is a great title, but the title of the book is This Chair Rocks: A Manifesto Against Ageism, and the most important words in the title are manifesto and ageism. It is not just a call to feel more educated and way better about your own late life. It is an urgent call to collective social and political action.
Very important, very worthy work. And when you self-publish, that takes a lot of effort, very courageous. I've had friends who've gone down that route. Did you try to get published with a publishing house and it just wasn't happening?
I did. I went the regular route. The publisher that had an option said in a meeting, they said, well, we're concerned that no one else is writing about this.
Duh.
And I managed to say, with, I thought, extreme tact, I think you should see that as a feature, not a bug. But, publishers are not, generally speaking, terribly adventurous. And I think it was just a new idea. And once again, age cooties. I think that people jump to this assumption that anything to do with aging is going to be yucky and depressing, when, of course, as I think you will attest, my book is anything but. And so no one made me the kind of offer that was worth it to me. And I thought, well, you know what? I might as well retain control of it, do all the hard work myself, and put it out in the world the way I want to do it.
Thank goodness you did, and it's become a hit.
Thanks. Yeah. And I'm very excited that it's now going to get some mainstream muscle behind it.
Final question before I let you go. If you had unlimited resources to tackle ageism in all its tiresomeness, what would you do tomorrow?
Well, take a vacation and spend at least a week or two.
Not on a cruise ship, promise?
Not on a cruise ship. Somewhere involving a beach and rum cocktails and sun, so I could stay out of the sun, of course.
And you'd still do your blog, Is This Ageist? But if you could really corral the energy of the wider population, the global population, if you'd literally do some big stroke things tomorrow.
I think what I would do is, this is not a big stroke answer, but is fun. Throw money at the millions of people doing interesting activism. And I would organize a global conference on how to approach ageism from an intersectional perspective, how to bring people with disabilities and people of color and people on, queer activists, people on the, different sides of the gender spectrum. How can we use the fact that we all age how can we come together around that, this universal form of discrimination, and come together, use that as a unifying factor to address all these oppressions that combine and oppress us all, because the world is facing some pretty serious problems, and I think there's no question that we need to come together at all ages to address them. So I would really try and put this pie in the sky notion out into the world.
Ashton, it's been such a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you so much.
Links to all will be on the show page of this episode of The Big Middle, which you can find on Apple Podcasts, Google, Stitcher, you name it, all your favorite pod apps. And of course, my website, susanflory.com. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.